Policy podcast. With us, we have Alex from the British Isles. You've spent a couple of weeks or even months now in Poland, and the last couple of weeks have been very rainy and dark. How are you getting used to this climate over here?
I love it. I'm Scottish, so it's in fact summertime for us.
It could be worse, you say.
Very much, yeah. And I have to say, I love the country as well, the people. I mean, Warsaw has been made somewhat grim by the events of the last century, but I mean, what an upbeat society in general.
Some say that the architecture is still a little bit grey and uninspiring.
There's something honest about Empire Gothic brutalism, the Soviet architecture. I know it's not everyone's taste, but
it does feel like it has a little bit of a renaissance right now. There's a lot of these accounts on Instagram and TikTok. They put some Russian music on it, and they take these pictures from the late 90s, and people get nostalgia all of a sudden for these old Soviet blocks that they were raised in.
Yes. I think also in their sculpture, I have to say, also the sculpture of the Third Reich, there was an appreciation for an aesthetic which was lost in a lot of the post-war Western movements. Appalling as these regimes were, there was a sense of proportion and discipline in architecture and in art. And you don't see it in, for example, Ceausescu's palace in Romania, which is built out of the materials people use to line their swimming pools in Surrey. I have to say the Palace of Culture in a centre, I understand it's a remnant of a rather painful era for a lot of people here, but I'm glad that they have opted not to pull it down.
Well, it does have some Art Deco features to it, but as you mentioned, this is actually something that has been debated for a long time in Poland. Should it be pulled down? Should it stay up? But probably what everybody agrees on, that it needs a good cleaning, that's for sure. It used to be quite white back in the day. Now it's yellowish brown.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think a lot of the coal black and buildings in the centre of London, Whitehall, where the civil service is located in Westminster, it used to be really quite black. And they cleaned it up, and it kind of looks a little bit of a white elephant now. I think the Palace of Culture merges with the Polish overcast sky in a way that your new modern arts museum right next to it does not. And it's certainly, the Palace of Culture is less offensive than your modern arts museum.
We did enter the topic here of the British Isles, of London. You worked over there quite closely on the famous Brexit campaign.
I did.
How was that experience? Why did you get involved with it? And did it go more or less as you thought it would go if Brexit would win that referendum?
No, nothing panned out as anyone thought. I started, I suppose, because I was working in Westminster for a Tory backbencher, one of the Thatcherite old guard, if you like. And there was a visible frustration in the Parliament at that time because it was impossible to pass legislation. The front bench of the British government, they're both in the civil service and in the Parliament, right? And most law in the UK is passed in the form of delegated legislation, so statutory instruments and so forth. And you have a very large cadre of civil service who can therefore tell the front bench of the government what they can and can't do. If you're in government, you don't want to rock the boat by attempting to pass a law which comes into conflict with the delegated, the statutory instruments and the delegated legislation. And it's never in the interest of the governing party to admit to the population that they're unable to pass a policy which they might have promised in their manifesto or might have realized beforehand they wouldn't be able to try to pass. They always had to find an excuse. So there was a sort of systemic dishonesty in a lot of our sort of reasoning to the population why we were unable to do things. And in reality, it was civil servants who were taking their commands quite often almost directly, and in some cases directly from Brussels. And there was always an argument of how much of our law comes from Brussels and how much of it comes from Parliament. And in the UK, and people came up with sort of 80-20 sort of ratios. But actually, you couldn't quantify it because it was a matter of a veto. There were some things which could not be done. And I say that if a European court or a European jurisdiction can tell you what to do in 1% of cases, you've essentially you've got a stranglehold on that country. It's a 0% democracy. Rather in the same way that if a bank is 99% honest in all of its transactions, but occasionally when it really needs to, it will kind of pull the rug out and do something dishonest when it needs to save its skin. Well, you wouldn't say that such a bank is 99% honest. It's 100% dishonest. And once you saw that, you couldn't very easily unsee it. So that's when I went up to Brussels. I started knocking on doors, and I joined Nigel Farage's team for a while. And that was very interesting. Of course, the European Parliament is another thing altogether. I think it's the only serious legislature in Europe since the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, which could neither make nor repeal legislation. It could only rubber stamp what came from the Commission. It could say yes or. It was interesting, yeah, and remember that the I think one thing which is forgotten about the Brexit movement is that we never lobbied for a referendum. We understood that
yes, that was given to you instead.
It was given
by the Tories.
It was given to us by people who wished to see us wiped out, and I won't name the MEP in question, but. There was a conservative Europhile, I should say Euro-federalist MEP who worked on the floor above me, and he called me up to his office. I was friends with one of his staffers, and he said, "Oh, hello, Alexander, do come in and sit down. I knew your grandfather," that sort of thing going on. He said, "No, what is this? Why are you working for these nut jobs in the UK Independence Party?" And I said, "Well, I explained to him that I thought that the veto that Europe had and European courts had over our civil service, over our courts and so forth was unacceptable, and we had to raise attention." That this was going on. I had to raise awareness that was going on and hopefully provide reasons for other MPs in the House of Commons in Britain to speak up about it. And he said, "Okay, yeah, great. What we're going to do, what we've got to do is have a referendum on this." And the idea was, words to the effect of, we'd have a referendum and people would vote to remain in the EU, and that would get rid of the UK Independence Party vote. Remember, the Tories then were in coalition. They really needed that vote that we were taking off them. So it was a slightly malicious attempt to get rid of the question being asked, get rid of the debate. It would go dead for a generation if they could get rid of us like that. And so they did. They rolled the dice. They had that referendum, and it backfired. And I have to say that MEP. The next day called for a second referendum. They didn't want to go down with their ship. And when that failed, I believe he became what they call a plastic paddy. He got himself an Irish passport. So the whole, it was extraordinary because we did get one or two seats in the British Parliament. But I always said to Nigel Farage, we can do this without getting a single seat in the Parliament. He didn't recognise that himself. He was a megalomaniac. Great guy, by the way, but he didn't really understand he was running a one-issue party, in my opinion. I said, all we had to do is find the difference between two major parties, where Labour and Conservative, for instance, are very close in a constituency, and we have to throw our weight in behind whichever is the more Eurosceptic candidate. And you say, "Oh, no, I completely understand your point there, Alexander. Very good point. But when you speak to people on the London Underground or in taxis, and they want to vote for UKIP, they want to vote for us because of our policies on healthcare and military expenditure and education." And I say, "Yeah, Nigel, for heaven's sakes, what are our policies on healthcare and military expenditure and education?" "Well, I don't know. That's beside the point." It was, I think, a one-issue party, and to his credit, he did very well. I didn't expect once they called that referendum, I thought, okay, that's over. It's over for a generation. We're not going to have this debate about whether we should be in Europe or not. And I think even on the night of the vote, Nigel conceded defeat, and then he unconceded about an hour later because he realized he was going to win. Really a hero, the guy. I mean, I think he's an absolute titan in politics. We owe an awful lot to him.
Well, it was a very special time. It was more or less also, I mean, it was a little bit before Donald Trump won his election.
Yeah.
But it was more or less the same time. And you could say that these were two gut punches for a lot of people.
Very divisive.
Because they didn't see it coming, neither in the first case nor in the second.
Well, and there's a slight difference, actually. In the case, unlike Trump, with Brexit, it has caused a rift within our society. You know, there are people who don't talk to each other because, you know, the other side voted the other way and so forth. But I think something which isn't often examined is actually it's caused a rift among the Brexiteers first. A lot of people back in London were, you know, they were nominally in favour of our independence, and they always complained about the EU. But then when we got out, they were rather furious. We had, I don't want to name anyone, but there are some rather sort of, there are some politicians and political commentators with a lot of gravitas in the system. And I think that the fact that we achieved with a very small number of people what they had all wanted to achieve but didn't dare to think was possible, I think that has opened a slight rift on the left, on the sort of political right of the spectrum. It's not just about, you know, those who wanted to remain and those who wanted to leave. It's within the category of those of us who wanted to leave, there are those who didn't dare to think it would be possible, and those of us who did. And there's a lot of professional jealousy now.
And then also there was the debate about how it went, because for a couple of years it was this never-ending saga that would continue in the daily news after month after month. First there was one prime minister, then another, then a third.
I'm telling you, Adam, we saw this coming. I mean, those of us who understood how European law was passed into British law, we knew that we couldn't just leave like that.
It was too intertwined.
It was very, very, and after the referendum, you know, immediately there was sort of a panic. You know, we thought, how can this be done? And I think we kind of bent the constitution a bit to get it done, probably. But then, you know, the concept of having a referendum like that is already a bit constitutionally dubious in Britain. You know, we don't share the European enlightened values in the way of the Swiss, or, you know, you don't get the nation to vote on things to get things done. That's not how you do things.
If we leave just the issue of Brexit itself, with your work in Brussels, you got to spend quite a lot of time in the European Parliament. You mentioned earlier that it was different compared to Westminster. But how would you characterize your time in the European Parliament? How were relations with these various MEPs and assistants from other countries, from other cultures?
Extremely boring. The only people who had any principles at all were the sorts of people who were a little bit kind of dubious, really. So we had our little clique, I guess, in the cafeterias and in the restaurants, you know, the extremists, if you like. I don't want to characterize as extremists, because actually our position is normal. But I do remember, I think there was the communists and Sinn Féin, and there were these people kind of on the fringes who found themselves in rather good company with each other, even though we held nothing in common politically. But they were more interesting to speak to, because, I mean, so many people were just trying to hold on to the plaudits of PR and the middle ground, and you just got they're like Brezhnev-era apparatchiks, really, reading out the party line. They were so boring. You'd never go drinking with them.
Speaking about drinking, it seems that you have the European Parliament, and right in front of it you have this big square, Luxembourg Square, or Lux.
Yeah.
And the amount of people working in the European Parliament sitting there drinking every lunch, after work.
Many happy evenings at Place Lux,
Yes. So is there a little bit, especially among the younger, well, now there are more and more younger MEPs as well, but especially these assistants, APAs, who are often 25, 6, 7, maybe 30 years old.
Yeah, that was me.
Did it turn into some form of a little bit of a party city due to all of these?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I have to say, you know, if you worked in a party that was worth its salt. You understood that a lot of the work you're doing was just sort of total rubbish in the parliament. You couldn't vote on anything meaningful. So your party leaders would address the gallery rather than the other people in the parliament. It was one of these parliaments that was designed to be overheard. It wasn't designed to discuss with itself. And if you were working on the secretariat or something like that, you'd be out of the office by midday. You'd be drunk by lunchtime. Yeah. That was how it went.
How were the relations with the Poles? Back then, it wasn't much of an alliance going on between UKIP and the Poles. It wasn't obvious, maybe.
No, by instinct, I spent an awful lot of time in the offices of the Hungarians, Fidesz. And
which back then used to be a mainstream party in the EPP, the largest centre-right or largest party group in the European Parliament at all.
God, you say that. Is it not still?
It is absolutely.
It is. Yeah, no, it was then. Yes, exactly. It wasn't in the. I think you have to remember. I was there a long time ago, before Brexit was a word and before it really got serious. We were, we were the true Finns were on our corridor. I didn't work for the Parliament itself. I worked for a secretariat called it was then called the EFD, the Europe of Freedom and Democracy.
Yes.
Which is technically a part of the civil service, I think. It sort of provided office staff to various groupings. It was UKIP, which was by far the biggest in that grouping.
The Sweden Democrats.
The Sweden Democrats. I think you're right. Yes. Now you mention it, and was Le Pen in there? No, she was something else. There was another group, sort of to the right, with the sort of the edgelords.
Yes.
I can't remember.
Yeah, no, Le Pen was not there. The EFDD. Nigel was doing his best to stay away from the extremes in Europe.
Yes. I would say Nigel was probably most at home with, in terms of who he would have hung out with if he wasn't hanging out with us. People like Daniel Hannan, regular, but
Tory.
very, very educated conservatives. Yeah, very, very clever guy, Daniel Hannan. They were kind of the mainstream right of the party.
If we leave the European Parliament itself and look just at Brussels, at a city, how did you find Brussels?
Beautiful. Didn't get bombed about a bit, did it? The thing is that a lot of the culture I engage with outside of office hours, first of all, you could take a train back to London, which I did every Friday. Yeah. And I took the first train back out on Monday morning. So I didn't really do weekends. But the après bureau, let me see. The European Secretariat, the civil service and so forth, harboured a huge number of incredibly intelligent but slightly understimulated people who were paid an enormous amount to do very little, but they all had to speak 3 languages to be in those positions. So by default, you had a great number of brilliant minds crammed together in the centre of the city. And I remember, I think the NATO had a Gilbert and Sullivan Society, which I joined. There were several choirs and sort of there was a Scottish dancing group. There are a lot of things you get involved with, but these were highly intelligent sort of professionals. A lot of them weren't making what I would call a wage which was sufficient to support a family. A lot of them were sort of single.
Yeah.
They had sort of, the sorts of parties that kind of, sort of slightly middle-aged professionals have. It was quite interesting. So.
But then apart from the city centre, there are also the neighbourhoods around it. Actually, they're part of the city centre now that have also...
Yes, I know where this is going.
They also have a poorer reputation these days. But probably Brussels have also... It looks worse now than it did 10 or 15 years ago. Is this also something that you think is true?
I can't speak for how it looked 10 or 15 years ago, or I haven't been back since 2013 or so, and I didn't know it before then. I lived far out of town, in a beautiful sort of suburb, and all I saw on the way to the Parliament, the one thing one always noticed if you looked out of the window were all the sort of neon lit girls in the shop fronts selling their bodies. At sort of 8 o'clock in the morning. I always wondered who on earth goes into a brothel at 8 o'clock in the morning. But you could see them from the railway tracks. Otherwise, I see the St. Hubert galleries, some beautiful churches. great Hanseatic architecture. I mean, 10 out of 10 for that.
Yes, well, back then, Brussels had not been struck by various terror attacks. That is a development that has happened a little bit later. Now, recently, we had 3 Swedes that were shot to death. There was another attack also a couple of days ago, but that later turned out wasn't terror-related, but an assistant of a Swedish MEP got shot together with 2 or 3 other people. And then, of course, naturally, the big terror attack against the airport and the subway, which happened just a few weeks after the large terror attack in Paris that people remember. So
yes, 2017 or so, was it?
Yes. So it seems, or 16, but it seems that this has left a trace on the city. People are thinking more about the terror threat and general problems with Islamization these days than they probably did 10 years ago. But I think this is something that goes and is true for all of Europe, especially Western Europe, naturally.
Yeah, I mean, I remember just before moving to Brussels, we do, of course, have Islamic cities in Britain. I'd worked on a campaign for UKIP, in fact. Gosh, no, it was while I was there. I flew up from Brussels to work on a campaign in the city of Bradford in the north of England. And we lost that campaign to George Galloway, who represented a party called Respect, basically who stood on an anti-Iraq war platform, which frankly I think most of us could get behind. And that's right. It was a surprise win. We thought he did it because he did a deal with the mosques, I think. Good for him.
Yes, there are a couple of these cities in the UK that have gone farther than the rest of society. Bradford, as you mentioned, one of them. Luton, close to London, is another.
Yes.
Leicester, I believe, is a third. And when it comes to the big ones, then naturally both London and Birmingham have at least areas within the city that have also poor reputation these days.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is, the demographics of these places are very poorly understood. 2010, I was working in a Tory campaign in West London for Sean Bailey, who later ran to become the mayor of London. And by the way, he's a black man, and he faced an enormous amount of racism, but not white on black racism, but from other blacks writing into the office. I don't know what I'm allowed to say on camera or what, but they called him a coconut, as the expression, because he, you know, black on the outside and white on the inside. It's an expression that's used.
Yes, there was.
And they felt that he had betrayed the black people by becoming a Tory. You know, there's an idea. You know, you can only be properly black provided that you're a socialist. Which is terribly unfair. So he was fighting this racism, but I would go around the White City estate near to the BBC buildings in North and Shepherd's Bush, and you'd have the electoral roll, and it would list 3 people behind each door. You'd knock at the door, and 10 voices would go silent suddenly. You know, the authorities are here. A man in a suit. You know, they didn't speak enough English to understand. I was going to give them some ballot papers, and then a few years later, the Grenfell Tower, but still there, like a great piece of black tooth, and Notting Hill.
70 people or so lost their lives.
Well, exactly, but then the things they're trying to sort of identify how many people are actually in the charred remains by sort of picking up teeth and a bone and that sort of thing. And the thing is that the demographics of the people in the tower didn't correspond to the people we thought were living there. So because we've got a snapshot of the total sort of disconnect between the official population and the actual population.